Who is the Buddha? If you walk into a modern home decor store or a trendy restaurant, chances are you have encountered statues or images like this. A fat, laughing figure with a protruding belly and a jovial smile. This friendly, carefree image perfectly fits the common Western perception of Buddhism as a philosophy entirely centered around peace, easygoing happiness, and positive vibes. But, as it turns out, this popular laughing Buddha is actually a historical misidentification for most people. In reality, this figure is Budai, a 10th century Chinese monk from folklore whom some Chinese Buddhists venerate specifically as an incarnation of the future Buddha, Maitreya. He is fundamentally not the original Buddha in the sense that we usually mean it. Instead, the Buddha we are going to explore today is the supreme historical founder known as Siddhartha Gautama, a profound spiritual teacher who walked the earth around northern India and southern Nepal in the 5th century BCE. It was his radical insights and structural teachings that eventually grew into the global spiritual system we now know as Buddhism. You have likely heard the standard idealized story of Siddhartha Gautama, a narrative frequently pictured in mainstream movies like Little Buddha, starring Keanu Reeves. According to this legendary account, Siddhartha was a wealthy, highly sheltered prince whose father shielded him from all the miseries of the world. One fateful day, curiosity drove him to venture outside his majestic palace walls, where he unexpectedly encountered the raw realities of human existence: sickness, old age, and death. Deeply troubled and existential by this shattering experience, he made the radical choice to abandon his royal life, his crown, and his family to search for a definitive way out of human suffering. After years of searching, he eventually attained supreme awakening under a tree, becoming known to history as the Buddha. He then spent the remaining 45 years of his life walking from village to village, teaching others exactly how to overcome the psychological traps of existence. But before we dive deeper into the mechanics of that journey, I want to pose what might initially seem like a weird, counterintuitive question. When does the life of the Buddha actually start? Well, from a purely material standpoint, we might say it began sometime in the 5th century BCE, with his physical birth in the earthly body that would eventually achieve enlightenment. However, because Buddhists operate under fundamentally different assumptions about how the universe works, the answer to his origin story is not quite as simple as marking a date on a birthday calendar. In this video, we will explore the general Buddhist understanding of the Buddha, who he truly is, where he came from, and what he accomplished, while simultaneously examining what modern secular scholars believe about him as a verifiable historical figure. To begin grasping who the Buddha is, we must look directly at the word itself. The term Buddha is not a personal name, it is a spiritual title. Etymologically, it comes from the ancient Sanskrit verbal root bud, which means to wake up. Therefore, the term Buddha literally translates to the awakened one. But this raises an immediate critical question. What exactly is he waking up from? To answer that, we have to turn our attention to traditional Buddhist cosmology, which is beautifully captured in this intricate, schematic representation of the universe known as the Bhava Chakra, or the Wheel of Life. While the specific visual example on your screen is a relatively recent artistic rendering, these types of cosmic structural diagrams have an immensely long, rich history across Asian Buddhism. The most vital structural point to understand about the Wheel of Life is that it functions precisely like a wheel. It turns round and round endlessly, with no inherent cosmic beginning or end. This structure exists because early Buddhists, like most ancient South Asians, believed deeply in the concept of rebirth. They maintained that when your physical body dies, that is absolutely not the end of the road. Instead, your consciousness is immediately reborn into another realm within the cyclic engine. You might find yourself reborn here, in the blissful realm of the gods, or perhaps down here, in the terrifying, tortured realm of the hell beings, or even in the realm of animals, driven entirely by instinct and survival. This process of death and migration repeats itself infinitely. Eventually, every single being dies and is reborn. Even the powerful gods within this system are mortal and subject to the turning of the wheel. Crucially, early Buddhists did not believe that some supreme creator god engineered this massive cycle. It simply is the baseline architecture of reality. And while the idea of being constantly reborn into new lives might sound like an exciting, eternal adventure to a modern Westerner, that is historically the exact opposite of how Buddhists viewed it. Instead, this endless, unceasing loop of being born, experiencing old age, suffering, dying, and then being forcefully reborn to suffer all over again was viewed as inherently painful, exhausting, and something that desperately needed to be escaped. The technical term for this endless, painful wheel of existence is samsara. The Buddha is quite simply the rare individual who has successfully conquered and broken through the suffering of samsara by attaining nirvana, a term we can translate as complete spiritual awakening, extinguishment, or enlightenment. Once a Buddha has achieved nirvana, they are no longer bound by the gravity of samsara. They are completely liberated from its endless cycles of death and rebirth. Furthermore, a Buddha is not just a solo escapee. He is someone who possesses the precise pedagogical skill to teach other sentient beings how to orchestrate their own escape. So, returning to the literal title, the Awakened One, the Buddha is the person who is snapped awake to see the actual, raw nature of reality as it is, while the rest of humanity continues to stumble blindly through the landscape of samsara in a dreamlike, ignorant state. In fact, according to traditional Buddhist cosmology, there have actually been many Buddhas throughout cosmic history. While the historical figure we recognize is Siddhartha Gautama, traditional doctrine maintains that he is merely one individual in a vastly long, ancient lineage of Buddhas. How does that work? We have to remember that in the Buddhist understanding, cosmic time is entirely cyclical and operates on a scale of billions of years. The universe expands, collapses, and recreates itself over beginningless time. Every so often, during a specific epoch, a sentient being manages to fully realize the ultimate nature of reality, achieves Buddhahood, and re-establishes the path to awakening for the world. Unfortunately, because of the entropic nature of samsara, each time a Buddha passes away, his teachings are gradually misunderstood, diluted, and eventually forgotten entirely over thousands of years. When that happens, the world enters a dark period of spiritual ignorance. Then, at some later point, when the spiritual need is absolute, another Buddha arises to repeat the cycle. This brings us back to Budai, the laughing monk we mentioned earlier, whom some traditions view as a precursor to Maitreya, the designated future Buddha of the next cosmic era. Each of these Buddhas teaches the exact same core truth, which Buddhists refer to as the Dharma. They teach the same message because the fundamental nature of suffering and the psychological path to overcome it never change. Our Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, never claimed to be inventing a new religion or teaching a novel philosophy. He maintained that he had simply rediscovered an ancient, long-lost highway through the jungle, the exact same truth that many forgotten Buddhas before him had mapped out. But if there are multiple Buddhas across time, how does an ordinary being actually transform into one? According to Buddhist doctrine, achieving Buddhahood is not a sudden stroke of luck or a spontaneous divine grace. It is the result of an unimaginably long, arduous process of gradual mental training, moral discipline, and perfection that takes place over millions, if not billions, of lifetimes. And this epic multi-life journey always begins with a solemn, foundational vow. Many Buddhist traditions trace our Buddha's origin story back to a previous cosmic age, during the time of an ancient, past Buddha named Dipankara. Dipankara was a fully awakened master who attracted massive crowds wherever he went. One day, a young, intensely dedicated ascetic named Sumedha came to hear him speak. As Dipankara was walking down a road, Sumedha noticed a large, muddy puddle directly in the path of the honored teacher. Anxious to prevent the feet and robes of the Buddha from getting soiled, Sumedha performed an act of total devotion. He prostrated his own body flat onto the road, spreading his long, dark hair over the mud puddle so that Dipankara could walk across him safely. When Dipankara stepped over him and noticed this profound act of humility, he paused, looked down at Sumedha, and made a shocking cosmic prediction. He pointed at the young ascetic and announced to the crowd, "One day, eons from now, you will be born as Siddhartha Gautama, and you will successfully achieve supreme awakening and become a Buddha." Hearing this prophecy, Sumedha officially made a vow within his heart to dedicate his entire cosmic future to achieving that goal. This pivotal moment set him on a journey across countless lifetimes, gradually accumulating immense spiritual virtue and positive karma. The Buddhist tradition meticulously remembers these millions of past lives in a vast genre of sacred literature known as the Jataka tales, or birth stories. These are highly symbolic, moral accounts of the Buddha's former existences prior to his final life. During this entire preparatory phase, before he is fully awakened, he is technically not yet a Buddha. Instead, he is known in the Sanskrit language as a bodhisattva, which translates to a being whose essence is oriented directly toward awakening. In these stories, the bodhisattva takes on many forms, both human and animal, with each life serving as a classroom to perfect a specific virtue. In one famous Jataka tale, the bodhisattva is a heroic monkey king who stretches his own body across a deep chasm to act as a physical bridge, allowing his monkey subjects to safely flee from an attacking royal army. In another, darker story, he is a compassionate prince who encounters a starving, desperate mother tigress in the woods, who is about to succumb to hunger and abandon her newborn cubs to die. Driven by absolute empathy, the prince willingly sacrifices his own physical body, letting the tigress eat him so that she has the strength to nourish her cubs. Through these varied lifetimes, the bodhisattva systematically perfects the essential qualities required for a Buddha: patience, unshakable discipline, deep meditative insight, wisdom, and, perhaps most importantly, radical generosity. After millions of lives of accumulating this immense reservoir of good karma, the bodhisattva is finally reborn into what the tradition considers his absolute last human body, Siddhartha Gautama. Up until this point, we have been exploring the traditional, theological accounts of the Buddha's life. But now, let us step back and ask an entirely different question. What do we actually know about the Buddha from the perspective of modern critical history? Historically speaking, he was born in southern Nepal at a sacred site called Lumbini, located very close to the modern geopolitical border with India. He was raised in a highly complex, multi-religious social context, heavily influenced by Vedic Brahmanism, the early ancestor of modern Hinduism. His personal name, Siddhartha, structurally means he who achieves his ultimate goal, while the name Gautama indicates the specific patriarchal clan he belonged to. His people were the Shakyas, an independent oligarchic clan, which explains why he is frequently referred to historically as Shakyamuni Buddha, the sage of the Shakya clan. Historians generally agree that he lived and taught around the 5th century BCE. I am emphasizing the word around, because scholars still debate the exact historical timelines and specific facts of his life. What makes historical reconstruction incredibly tricky is that there are virtually no surviving contemporary records from this specific time and place, nor is there any direct archaeological evidence that dates precisely to his lifetime. What we do have are the extensive Buddhist textual accounts. The earliest of these are preserved in the Pali Canon, which traditionalists maintain is a direct stenographic record of the speeches and teachings given by the Buddha during his life. According to the tradition, these texts were carefully memorized by his monastic followers immediately after his death and transmitted orally for centuries, before finally being committed to writing around the 1st century BCE in Sri Lanka, hundreds of years after the Buddha had passed away. Despite this long gap of oral transmission, modern linguistic and historical scholars maintain that a significant portion of this textual material is authentic and dates back at least to the 3rd century BCE, the era of the great emperor Ashoka. So, what do these earliest, most authentic texts actually say about the Buddha's early life? Surprisingly, the answer is not very much. In these ancient Pali discourses, the Buddha only makes the most fleeting, vague autobiographical references to his past, completely omitting the elaborate stories of his miraculous birth and palace life. For example, let us look at a text called the Aryapariyesana Sutta, or the Noble Search. Scholars consider this to be one of the earliest autobiographical fragments available, dating very close to the first few centuries after his death. In it, the Buddha describes his radical decision to leave home in a remarkably simple, human way. Later, while still young, a black-haired young man endowed with the blessing of youth, in the prime of life, though my mother and father wished otherwise and wept with tearful faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, put on the yellow robe, and went forth from the home life into homelessness. Notice how starkly simple and grounded this original account is. There are no mentions of grand golden palaces, hidden truths, or cosmic signs. However, as the centuries rolled by, later generations of Buddhists naturally wanted to expand these brief accounts into highly elaborate, dramatic biographies to flesh out the Buddha as a legendary character. The highly cinematic version of his life that most people are familiar with today actually dates in its written form to around the 5th century CE, more than 800 years after the death of the historical Buddha. As objective historians, we have to recognize that these later biographies contain a vast amount of legendary, symbolic material that the historical Siddhartha Gautama likely never experienced or taught. But as students of religion, we must also understand that these developed stories are immensely important because they are the precise narratives that later Buddhists used to illustrate and understand the deep psychological mechanics of the Dharma. According to these later, highly detailed biographies, the being who became the Buddha was born a wealthy prince whose birth was accompanied by spectacular, miraculous anomalies. His mother, Queen Maya, dreams that a majestic white elephant with 6 tusks enters her side, discovering shortly after that she is miraculously pregnant. When the infant Siddhartha is born in the grove at Lumbini, his very first action is to take 7 steps to the north, causing lotus flowers to bloom under his feet, as he boldly proclaims to the cosmos, "I am the chief of the world." In this version of the narrative, Siddhartha is deliberately raised in an artificial environment of pure luxury. His father, terrified of a prophecy that his son would abandon the throne to become a penniless monk, builds massive walls around him, banning any sight of old age, sickness, grief, or death from his presence. Siddhartha grows up, marries a beautiful princess, fathers a healthy son, and lives a life of uninterrupted sensory pleasure. But human artifice cannot outsmart reality forever. One day, the benevolent gods intervene, planting the intense desire within Siddhartha's mind to see what lies outside the pristine palace walls. Siddhartha convinces his faithful chariot driver, a man named Channa, to take him out on an unapproved tour of the city. It is during this series of excursions that Siddhartha encounters what have become universally known in Buddhism as the four sights. First, he encounters a frail, trembling old man. Shocked, he asks Channa, "What is that creature?" Channa gently informs him that this is old age, a process that naturally decays all living human beings. On his second trip, he witnesses a man writhing in intense pain from a terrible disease. He asks Channa, what is wrong with him? Channa explains that sickness is an unavoidable vulnerability that strikes all mortals. On the third excursion, he sees a cold, motionless corpse being carried toward a cremation pyre, surrounded by weeping relatives. Horrified, Siddhartha asks, "What is that?" And Channa delivers the ultimate existential truth. That is death, and it is the absolute destination for all living beings. According to the legend, this was the absolute first time Siddhartha had ever conceptualized that human beings inevitably decay, get sick, and die. Suddenly, the illusion of his perfect life shatters. He looks at his wealth, his fine food, and the beautiful dancers in his palace, and realizes they are all temporary masks hiding an underlying tragedy. He recognizes that his comfortable world is nothing but the terrifying engine of Samsara. It is during his final excursion that he encounters the fourth sight, a serene, quiet ascetic monk sitting in deep meditation. Channa explains that this man has abandoned the world to seek a definitive way out of old age, sickness, and death. Inspired by this ascetic, Siddhartha makes the radical decision to leave his palace behind in the dead of night, quietly whispering goodbye to his sleeping wife and newborn son. While abandoning your family might seem deeply problematic from a modern ethical standpoint, from Siddhartha's existential perspective, the greatest act of love he could perform for his son was to leave and find a definitive cure for the universal disease of mortality. He sets out into the forest, completely shedding his royal identity to live as a wandering religious beggar. He studies under the greatest meditation masters of his era, quickly mastering their techniques, but finds that their systems only offer temporary states of trance, not permanent liberation. Desperate for a breakthrough, he turns to extreme asceticism, attempting to conquer his mind by completely starving his body. For 6 agonizing years, Siddhartha eats nothing but a single grain of rice or a leaf a day, becoming so painfully emaciated that his ribs resemble a collapsed roof, and he can feel his spine when touching his stomach. Eventually, collapsed on the ground from exhaustion, Siddhartha realizes that this self-torture is a dead end. It is not solving the problem of suffering, it is simply destroying his physical brain and body. Realizing he needs physical strength to achieve spiritual victory, he accepts a simple bowl of milk rice from a village girl. Formally discovering the middle way, the path that avoids both the extremes of luxury and the extremes of self-mortification. Nourished, he walks to a massive Bodhi tree in modern-day Bodh Gaya, sits down on the grass, and vows never to stand up until he has solved the riddle of existence. During the night, a powerful demon deity named Mara, the personification of delusion, desire, and death, unleashes armies of monsters and illusions to terrify and tempt him. Siddhartha remains completely unshakable, touching the bare earth with his hands to call the world as a witness to his eons of accumulated virtue. Mara's armies shatter, and as the morning star rises, Siddhartha fully wakes up to the deep structure of reality. He becomes the Buddha, discovering the precise path out of illness, suffering, and death. One fascinating aspect of this story you might have noticed is that the Buddha is consistently portrayed as a superhuman, quasi-divine entity, accompanied by miraculous omens, intervening deities, and magical abilities. This often surprises modern Westerners because many contemporary secular adaptations of Buddhism purposely downplay or delete the supernatural elements. However, for almost the entirety of Buddhist history, the vast majority of practicing Buddhists have maintained that the universe is densely populated by invisible forces, gods, and demons, and that the Buddha himself possessed immense supernatural powers. The popular modern view of the Buddha as merely a rational, secular psychologist is largely the product of Buddhist modernism, a historical reform movement that emerged in the 19th century to align Buddhism with Western science and Enlightenment philosophy. To conclude, the single most important takeaway from studying the life of the Buddha is the realization that there are, in fact, many lives of the Buddha. Within the internal logic of the tradition, this is true because our Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is held to be just one link in an infinite cosmic chain of awakened masters, with each individual Buddha requiring billions of lifetimes of dedicated practice to manifest. But, as secular historians of religion, we can also say there are many lives of the Buddha because his biography has never been a static, frozen text. For over 2,500 years, diverse Buddhist communities across India, China, Tibet, and the West have continually retold, reshaped, and reimagined his story to ground different types of practices, validate different philosophical schools, and address the specific sufferings of their unique eras. This creative proliferation of his life continues to this very day, as modern people worldwide continue to retell his ancient story in order to discover new, innovative ways of overcoming the universal human suffering that all of us must face.